Wow, that coupler's really low. How do we fix it? Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Back in 2020, I started adding the Rip Track segment to my product reviews. The Rip Track segment is where I address any minor issues that came up with the model during the review process, like coupler height or body wobble or other things that can be relatively easily fixed. A viewer suggested that I do a compilation video, and I thought that was a pretty good idea. So for this first episode, we're going to do all of the Rip Track segments from 2020. The A-end coupler was low, so let's see if we can raise it. I'll start by removing the truck. Since the coupler was fairly low, I'm going to try a KD red washer, which is 15 thousandths thick. Now it looks good. I'll check the B-end again just to make sure it didn't change while I was fixing the A-end. Unfortunately, now it looks a hair low. Raising or lowering one end of a car with washers can sometimes have the opposite effect on the other end. I'll try a gray washer on the B-end, which is 10 thousandths thick. Now the B-end looks good, but the A-end is low again. I'll swap the single red washer on the A-end for two gray ones. Now the A-end looks good. And the B-end looks good too. Sometimes it takes a little trial and error to get it right. When tightening the trucks, I want to make sure to restore the three-point suspension that the car had to keep it from wobbling. One truck needs to be tight enough so that it pivots but won't rock side to side. The other needs to be looser so that the car can roll over uneven track. This car is now ready for service. I like to mark cars that I've already worked on with a dot of green paint somewhere on the bottom. First, I want to fix that broken step. I'll start by placing the model on its side on some of the foam from inside the box. The foam will help to protect small details from further damage. Closer examination reveals that the step actually broke on one side and became detached on the other. I'll use some liquid styrene cement to carefully glue the step back into place. After gluing, I like to check to make sure everything is straight. Next, I want to fix the rear coupler. The ScaleTrains couplers are metal and I'm sure they work fine, but I prefer KDs, so I'm going to swap the couplers on both ends of my model. I'll use a KD158 whisker coupler in the rear. I like to put my models in foam cradles like this one when working on the underside. I'll start by removing the coupler screw. The draft gear box comes apart easily once the screw is removed. Since I'm going to use a whisker coupler which doesn't need a separate spring, I'll remove the ScaleTrains centering spring. This one wasn't working right anyway. The KD drops right into the ScaleTrains draft gear box. When replacing the coupler, I use something to hold the uncoupling lever so it doesn't get caught on the draft gear box. Now I just need to replace the screw. The new coupler came out at the right height. I used another KD158 in front and that one looks pretty good too. The real test though is will something else couple to the front. Sometimes the KD trip pins get hung up on snowplow equipped locomotives. Thankfully this one looks okay. Since ScaleTrains supplied some extra rotating end caps, let's see if it's possible to remove the speed recorder. I'm using the flat of the blade on my hobby knife to pry up the speed recorder detail. I'm not trying to cut anything. I removed one of the extra end caps from the bag. Now I just need to push it onto the end of the axle. This took a little bit of force, so it's important to be careful not to damage the end cap or push the wheels out of gauge. Putting the additional holes in the truck side frames could be done easily with a drill bit, but I'm going to wait until I can do some more research. I don't want to put the holes in the wrong places. I can't see a good way to fix the hood door with the oversized grille without doing some major surgery, so I'm going to leave that alone. If after some more research I decide to replace the horn, it would be easy enough to swap it out for an aftermarket casting. This is a tank car, and since I don't like plastic couplers, I'm going to change the couplers on my car to KD119 SE type shelf couplers. The draft gear boxes have screws on the bottom. There are no uncoupling levers to worry about, so it's pretty straightforward. I'll start by removing the screw that holds the draft gear box cover in place. The old coupler comes apart in two halves. The KD couplers drop right in. Now I just need to replace the screw. Unfortunately, the new coupler on the A end is now low. The one on the B end is also low. Both couplers are drooping, so I'm going to try shimming the inside of the draft gear box. I'll cut a small strip of 10 thousandths styrene to fit inside the draft gear box. The Atlas draft gear box lid is stepped so that part of it fits inside the draft gear box. I'll use some liquid styrene cement to secure the shim. The strip needs to be the same width as the inner part of the lid. Now I'll reassemble the couplers. The B end worked fine, but the A end is a little sticky. The coupler can't snap back to center like it's supposed to. After taking the coupler box apart again, I'll use a flat file to remove just a little bit of material from the shim. Now it works like it's supposed to. I'll take the lids off one more time and use a black Sharpie to darken the shim so they're not so obvious. With everything back together, now the A end looks good. So does the B end. I'm pretty sure I got rid of the centering problem, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to put some Katie Greasem into the draft gearboxes. This is a dry powdered graphite lubricant. After adding some of the graphite, I'll wiggle the couplers back and forth a few times to spread it around. Blowing on the couplers will scatter any excess powder. When I'm done with all the mechanical fixes on a piece of rolling stock, I put a dot of green paint somewhere on the bottom. That way later on I'll know that I've already worked on this car. This car is now ready to be weathered and put in service. My initial thought was to do a conventional coupler height fix to this car, adding washers to the A-end bolster to raise the low coupler. But when I removed the A-end truck, that's when I discovered that it was broken. This isn't really repairable, the truck needs to be replaced. I contacted Tangent about the broken truck and they were nice enough to send me a new set of trucks for free. They even let me opt for semi-scale wheels instead of the original wheels. I like semi-scale wheels on hoppers and tank cars especially, because they're so visible. Before installing, I like to check the wheel gauge on new trucks. These look good. Swapping the trucks is simple. Just remove the bolster screw, then remove the old truck and replace it with the new one. After I did that, I rechecked the coupler height. The coupler on the A end is now slightly high. The coupler on the B end is also a hair too high. And the car still wobbles. The car has molded on bolster pins that stick down through the trucks, making it impractical to remove material from the car. That leaves the trucks themselves. There's a slight raised area around the bolster on each truck. Thankfully, the car doesn't need to be lowered by very much. I'll use a flat file to remove some material from this area. Now the raised lip around the hole in the truck is mostly gone. Since both couplers were high, I did the same thing to both trucks. To fix the wobble, I'll file down one of the bolster pins on the car slightly, which will allow the bolster screw to clamp the truck a little tighter. You should only do this on one end, leaving the other truck free to rock back and forth. This creates a 3-point suspension and keeps the car from wobbling while still allowing it to roll over uneven track. When tightening the screw on the end that has the filed down bolster pin, the truck should be free enough to pivot but unable to rock side to side. The coupler on the A end is now correct. And the B end looks good too. The car no longer wobbles. The body stops rocking when the wheels settle onto the rails. Without the broken truck to cause drag, the car rolls much better too. I should mention that since I filed each truck by hand, they are now custom fit. In the future, I'll need to be careful not to swap them end for end if I ever need to disassemble the car for some reason. Though it could still stand some weathering, operationally the car is ready for the layout. I like to put a dot of green paint in an inconspicuous place under the car. That lets me know that this car has already been worked on. I like to put a green sticker on the box as well. I don't normally make any adjustments to a review score, however in this case I'd like to thank Tangent for being nice enough to send me a new set of trucks for free. Without the 5 points off for the broken truck, and evaluating the car with the new trucks on it before modifications, the adjusted score would be 85. The couplers are very low on my model and I don't really like the ScaleTrains couplers anyway. I'm going to replace mine with Katie Whisker couplers. I'll start by removing the front coupler box. Unfortunately, I had to take it out in pieces as it won't slip past the plow assembled. The rear coupler was much easier to extract. I won't need the coupler centering springs, so I'm taking them out. This is a Katie 158 scale coupler. It drops right into the ScaleTrains draft gearbox. When reinstalling couplers on a model like this, it's good to use a tool to move the uncoupling lever out of the way so it doesn't get caught between the draft gearbox and the pilot. After putting the new couplers on the engine, they're still down in the weeds. With the couplers off the model again, the shell can be removed by carefully pulling it upward. To make it easier to figure out what's going on, my first thought was to try to put the couplers on the chassis without the shell. Unfortunately, the screws actually go into the shell itself, passing through the metal pads at each end of the engine. Using the rear of the height gauge, it looks like the metal pads on the chassis are at the correct height. The screw mounts on the shell don't stick down below the metal pads, so that can't be the issue. My next thought was that there might be interference between the opening in the pilot and the raised area on the front of the draft gearbox. I'm going to file the back of this raised area to remove some material. The place where the paint is scraped off shows where I'm filing. Unfortunately, doing that didn't do the trick. I ended up having to file the top of the coupler box down. Even though the coupler mounting pads checked out, I'm also filing those to help get the coupler up to where it needs to be. After doing all that, the couplers are still a hair low. I'll cut a small strip of 10,000th styrene to use as a shim, then glue it inside the bottom of the coupler box to raise the coupler slightly. I also filed the detail on the bottom of the front draft gear box a little to make it easier to get past the plow. Finally, now the couplers are correct. I'm almost tempted to take another 5 points here because this was so much work. I'll use a small amount of CA glue applied with a piece of scrap wire to reattach the rear step. To fix the plow, I'll coax the broken piece back into position and secure it with some liquid styrene cement. Both cars had coupler issues. Since I prefer Katie's anyway, I'm going to change the couplers on both cars. I'm going to modify some KD119 couplers for these cars. The KD119 represents a Type SE coupler with an upper and lower shelf. These couplers on the prototype cars appear to be Type E's that only have the lower shelf, so I'll cut the top one off with a cutting disc and a motor tool. I'll finish it off with a flat file. The cutting and filing left a shiny spot on top of each coupler. To fix that, I'm going to pre-weather the couplers. First, I'll dry brush them with some flat brown paint. I'll get some paint on the brush, then wipe some of it off on a paper towel. Then I'll flick the brush over the coupler. The idea is to get just a little paint on it. I don't want the paint to go on wet, as if it gets in the wrong places, it can keep the knuckle from moving the way it's supposed to. It's good to check them after painting to make sure they still work as they should. Next, I'll use some Bragdon rust-colored weathering powder and dab it on the painted couplers with a stiff brush. This powder has an adhesive so it will stick to the couplers. Now that the couplers are looking better, I can install them in the cars. I'll remove the coupler screw and pull out the factory coupler. Be careful with the draft gearbox lid as the uncoupling lever attaches to it. Getting the factory coupler spring out is a little tricky. I pried it out with a hobby knife while using another to hold the lid out of the way. The KD whisker coupler drops right in. After the change, the A end coupler on the NS car is a little low. The B end is very low and droops. I'm going to try making a draft gearbox shim out of 010 styrene. I'll insert this under the coupler. After checking to make sure the coupler can still move side to side, I'll glue it with some liquid styrene cement. The B end coupler is still a little low, but it's better. To get the couplers up where they need to be, I'll raise the car. First, I'll remove the truck. Then I'll insert a KD gray washer over the bolster pin before reattaching the truck. I'll do this on both ends. While I'm at it, I'll tighten one truck screw enough so that the truck can pivot but not rock side to side. This should cure the wobbling problem. Be sure to leave the other truck free to rock a little bit so that the car can roll over uneven track. Now the A end looks pretty good, and the B end is spot on. The car no longer wobbles. I use the same process to fix the Conrail car. When I'm satisfied that I've fixed any mechanical issues, I like to put a dab of green paint in some inconspicuous place under the car so I'll know that it's already been worked on. It's hard to see, but each of the coil loads has lettering on the bottom that reads "this side down." If you look through the hole on the end, you can see that the weight takes up half the coil. The weight should be down so that it doesn't make the car top heavy. If you can't see the writing, you can also just put the load on a flat surface. It'll automatically come to rest with the heavy side down. As I mentioned earlier, I'd highly recommend using the weighted loads whether you plan to run the car with the hood or not. If you want to display the car with the hood removed, then the supplied stickers can be used to make the loads look better. I have found that using the seam is a good way to keep the sticker aligned so that it wraps around the load correctly. The load dividers have pins on the bottom that engage the holes along the car sides. They can be installed in many different positions. I don't know how prototypical this is, but here's an example of how the load dividers could be used. When using the loads, keep in mind that one of them isn't weighted. I'd recommend distributing the weighted loads as evenly as possible. I use CA glue to attach the hood guides. There are right and left versions. The hollow part faces outward with the small triangle toward the side of the car. Though they could still use some weathering, both of my cars are now ready for service.
So that's it for now. If you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.